Good afternoon. Good afternoon, more or less. Hello. A culminating event of our conference, which started on Monday, is with great excitement and honor to have the UN High Commissioner for Refugees with us. Filippo Grandi was appointed the 11th UN High Commissioner in 2016 and reappointed in 2021 for a term that was to 2023. But today we found out, and I'm happy to be maybe the first person to publicly announce that the, that the High Commissioner's appointment has been extended for another 2.5 years. So we're very, very pleased. In the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, the Refugee and Migrant Education Network was faced with the challenge of how do we keep the membership together, and we had to abandon our plans for in-person meetings and reinvent ourselves with a set of webinars. And in a meeting of the planning group, we said, wow, wouldn't it be wonderful if the High Commissioner would consider doing a webinar with us? And we all said, Tony, you know, you're working too hard and it won't happen. But the rector of the Gregorian and I wrote to the High Commissioner. He happens to be a graduate of the Gregorian University, so he's coming home, and he was extraordinarily kind to do the opening of what became a series of 8 webinars over 2021. So we're very, very happy to have you with us, Your Excellency, but in one sense I feel like we're welcoming you home, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony, and good afternoon, everybody. So I'm really happy to be here, and you already expressed some of the reasons. I did study here. I think to say that I was a graduate is a bit maybe overstating it, but I did. It was part of my academic curriculum, yes. I went through here for a year, many years ago. And I think it's the first time I'm back, actually, in the building since 1987. So there's a little emotion here. And I'm very happy also that this happens on this occasion to somehow briefly, at least, interact with a network that is doing something so important. And it is about education. And I was here for reasons of education. So, you know, life has sometimes these coincidences, and they're wonderful most of the time. And it's great. And of course, there's another coincidence that you also mentioned, that the UN has approved that I stay another couple of years, so another 3 years actually from now. And so it all comes together. These things all come together sometimes in life, and I'm very glad that they come together today. Now, another thing I wanted to say is, why I'm happy to be here, is that, of course, education, and in particular refugee education, given that I lead a refugee organization, is very, very central has been very central to our work and to our reflection for the past few years. Certainly before I became High Commissioner, but I can speak for the time when I have been High Commissioner, which is almost 7 years now, and certainly education has occupied a big part of our internal debate and our quest for new avenues and new solutions, new responses to the refugee crisis. You know, I've been working, I'll just share, I'm sure you've discussed much more in depth and your knowledge of this matter is much more sophisticated than mine, but let me still share a few thoughts with you, not least because I've been working with refugees for many years now, and since before I came to the Gregorian University. And I remember when I studied here, I volunteered in a Caritas center near Rome. So I've been with refugees, not a refugee myself, but with refugees for decades. And one thing that has always struck me is their passion for education, is the importance that education has in refugees' lives. I know we have here some of them who can say this to us, or have said this to you, I'm sure, directly, but this is something that always profoundly impressed me. I have worked with some of the most disenfranchised refugee populations in the world, with Afghan refugees, with Palestinian refugees over the years. And the more disenfranchised these populations are, the more education has a real and symbolic value in their lives. The more parents are ready, I've seen it time and time again, are ready to sacrifice even very meager resources to ensure that children go to education. And children understand that education is an asset that they need to go forward in context in which very often they don't have assets. So what you're doing is extremely, extremely important. I was speaking at the Transforming Education Summit last week in New York. There was a big education summit in the General Assembly. And I said that, this yearning for knowledge on the part of refugees, of displaced people, of stateless people, is really about identity. It's about normalcy in lives that are often so uprooted. It's about opportunity, of course, and fundamentally, and on a more philosophical level, if you wish, but also important, it's about hope. And identity, opportunity, normalcy, hope, these are important words for people in exile. Are words that signify them not giving up and staying resilient. Now, I also think, and I'm just telling you what you already know, that of course education is a pathway to dignity, right? And dignity is another very important word that we should never forget. This is one of the favorite words of Pope Francis, and I think I admire the way he uses the word to remind us of the importance of dignity for all, including for those that are marginalized and excluded. And education is a pathway to dignity. And it is that because it helps, of course, builds the capacity to be resilient. And in the case of people that are uprooted, the key word is to restart, to start again after having suffered very often so much loss. You know how difficult the world is today. You know about, you all very well aware, we live in a world in which, and we saw it so clearly last week in New York at the General Assembly, the discussion is about growing conflict everywhere in the world, about violence, discrimination, abuses of rights. In a way, one should reflect that perhaps a restart is what we all need, not just refugees. And education is such an important element of any restarting, of any resilience. The other thing that I think is important to reflect on before I zoom in a bit more on education issues is this tremendous dilemma that we're in, which is about living in a very interconnected world, very interconnected. I don't need to tell you, everything is now instantly interconnected. The challenges that we are facing, the climate emergency, the pandemic of which hopefully we've just come out, right now all over the world, especially among the poorer communities, the rising cost of living, the difficulty in obtaining livelihoods. Things like how the war in Ukraine is not only terrible for Ukrainians, but it means in this very interconnected world plagued by so many challenges that because of that war, children can go hungry in places as far away as the Horn of Africa or Central America, and we see it. We see it with our own eyes working there. And of course, the children are among the most affected by the negative impact of this interconnection. This interconnection is very positive. It gives us enormous opportunities. Unfortunately, it also causes problems that require unified responses that we don't seem to be able to put together. Look at the failure that we are living through in responding to the climate emergency, just to give you an example. And look at the failure that we constantly experience in making peace. You know, I've been saying for 7 years now, we live in a world which has become unable to make peace. That's why there's 100 million refugees and displaced people. That's why half of them are children, by the way, and that's why it's estimated, I'm not so sure how this estimate is done, but I think it's an interesting figure that there's more than 220 million children that live in situations of crisis, of life-threatening crisis. This is an enormous amount of people. And yet, in a world plagued by so many challenges, we don't seem to be able to find the unity to respond. I often say this day that, you know, the very institution to which I have devoted my life, the United Nations, one of its names is now betrayed by reality. And the world is not nations, is united. And we're not united anymore. Unity was the intuition of humanity after the Second World War to restart. And if we lose that unity, we risk backtracking in every aspect of our existence and our society. Now, having said this, given you these very gloomy pictures, I don't want to stop here because I think it would be unfair. And I think that we must really respond. Of course, we cannot change the course of big trends, but I think we can help do that. You know that I often quote Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany when her government was faced in 2015 with a huge wave of mostly Syrian refugees, and she was very much under attack also internally, saying it is impossible. They took in almost 1 million people, and you know, there's too many. And she responded famously in German, she said, "Wir schaffen das," we can do it. And I think that was a kind of rallying cry for the world, for solidarity to emerge from, you know, the shadows of being a little bit in clandestinity to being legitimate. And that was a very important gesture and phrase that she said. So I think that we need to live in that spirit, in the Wir schaffen das, in yes, we can do it spirit, we can act. And education is an example of that. Education is a very important example of that. And last week, maybe some of you were there at the Transforming Education Summit, you know, we heard many worrying things about the state of education in today's world. But we also heard that much progress has happened in all fields of education in the last few years. And, you know, an important thing I want to remind you of, I'm sure you've discussed it, is that my organization, the United Nations, in 2018, and that was also a result of that big flow of people towards Europe and the reflection that followed that flow, the United Nations established these two famous compacts, one on refugees and one on safe and orderly migration. They're very important set of tools that have been made available to governments, to civil society, to academia, to act, to respond in spite of all the challenges. And one of the beauties, I think, at least of the Refugee Compact, which is the one that obviously I know better, one of the beauties is that it pulls together in a spirit of unity not only governments that traditionally lead the responses, but civil society. but the private sector and academia and sports organization and faith-based organization. And I think this concept that you embody of a network to help respond to a crisis is really the philosophy of the compact. So what you're doing is the compact in action. And this is why I'm so happy to be here personally to encourage you to continue to do that. And look, you know, my education colleagues are here and they always give me statistics, rightly so, and those statistics are improving a little bit. Now they don't like me maybe to say that because we should always say we can do more. Sure, we can do more. But I remember when I started as High Commissioner, we used to say that refugee enrollment in primary education was 50%, meaning 50% of the refugees only, because the non-refugee rate is much higher, 50% were enrolled in primary education institutions. Now, I think we estimate it at 68%. So that 18% took 7 years, I don't know, 6, 7 years. These statistics might be imperfect, but I think they indicate a very clear trend. And if you look also at tertiary education in the same period of time went from 1% to 6%. Of course, if you look at outside, the non-refugees, much higher enrollment rates, but still there is progress. And this progress, I have no doubt, was due to more focus, more attention, and networks like yours becoming active in trying to promote the practice and the notion. And you know, you must be familiar, I'm sure you've spoken about it, my colleagues have spoken to you, this ambition of ours in terms of tertiary education, since we are talking in a very august and historical tertiary education institution, this 15 by 30, right? 15% of refugees enrolled in tertiary, including vocational training institutions, by 2030. And you know, can I say we're on track to that 15 by 30? Let's carry on. Now, I really don't want to say much more because you all know all these things much better than me. But just before I close, a few encouragements or directions that I'd like to suggest. You then have to choose what to do, but I think these may be useful. And some are pretty obvious, but let me repeat them again. First of all, because of all that I have said so far, please stay engaged. This is very, very important. You know, those challenges we have to face, and let me tell you, I and my colleagues live with them day in, day out, are very steep. And sometimes you say, you know, I can't do it, it's too much. So stay engaged. Staying engaged is so important because in the service of refugees is also about sharing with them a sense of possibility and the sense of future. If we abandon that, people that are much more exposed than us to hardship and deprivation, they will lose them as well, and then that's over. If hope is lost, you know, everything is lost. So stay engaged, and this is very important. And may I say, stay engaged and expand this network approach. This is very, very important. Expand it further. I know, because my colleagues have briefed me, that you have discussed that it would be great if the network expanded beyond what we call the global north. Maybe you're already expanding to also countries in the broader global south, where most actually of the refugees and displaced people live, contrary to the perception that they're all in the rich countries. In reality, most of the people displaced are in the poorer countries that need more help, but which have also institutions and civil society organizations. So, you know, stay engaged and expand. The second thing I would say, we must all together collectively, and I look at your important network to help with that, we must convince those who have the resources to mobilize more resources to support education globally. You know, there were some keywords at the Transforming Education Summit. One was inclusion. You know, we are all striving for an inclusive education in general, and I think that in terms of refugees, this word resonates even more. We want refugees to be able to have access to national education systems. That's also very much the core of the compact. But that requires resources, requires, of course, states hosting refugees to develop good inclusive policies, allowing refugees to go to their educational institutions. But then those same countries, mostly poor countries, will say, but without resources, we cannot do it. We cannot double the population of students in our schools, like we have seen in countries like Lebanon, for example, without those same institutions being strengthened. And this is not humanitarian work. This is development work. This is bilateral work. This is work for the international financial institutions. So, encouraging that resource mobilization in that towards inclusion, I think, is very, very, very important. And this was a big theme, I think, last week in New York, and I was very happy. But in the end, your power of advocacy in that respect is extremely important. The third point is, of course, when all is said and done, it is important to expand opportunities, meaning scholarships, what we call in UNHCR jargon complementary pathways, meaning education. I mean, in this country, there's an important project called University Corridors. I think some of you may have even benefited from it, and other countries have similar initiatives. It's important to multiply. They're still not, we need to scale them up. They're still rather small and not very widespread. So we need to encourage academic institutions to become part of these networks. That will also be an important advocacy factor for governments to open up, because they have to open up those corridors. And one important thing, of course, is in the same vein as I said a few minutes ago, is to ensure that those opportunities are available to refugees, to displaced people, also in the countries where they are now. Not every opportunity needs to be linked to a resettlement or to a transfer to another country. That, of course, can be a great opportunity, but it will always remain small. So we need to invest also in opportunity in the same country. The DAFI program does that. That's the foundation of what it is. And I think that would multiply opportunities for refugees and displaced people, for communities hosting them, in a manner that, by the way, preserves the capacity that is obtained from education in that same country. So you don't have a brain drain, in a way, if that is happening. So I would certainly encourage you to do that. The fourth, I have only one more, and then I close. The fourth is to really, and here I look at you as especially academic institutions, maintain and develop your collective scholarship and research on these issues. If we want to be successful in making the argument for inclusion, especially in education terms, we need data, we need knowledge, we need expertise, and you have a wealth of that, I'm sure, in your network, and I think it's important to strengthen this academic and policy case if we want to really be strong in making the case with the governments that have to make the policy decision or have to allocate the resources. And the final point I wanted to make is that this is a broader point, and I go back somehow to my introductory remarks, saying there's a lot of focus today on Ukraine, and rightly so. It's a major humanitarian emergency. There is relative strong focus on situations like Afghanistan. People suggested that I mention Syria. I'm not so sure. I'm just back from Syria. I think it's actually losing visibility as a human crisis. We need to restore some equity and equality in the responses, including in education. We cannot focus only on the situations that are in the limelight. And there, as a network, as a growing network, you can play an important role to highlight forgotten situation, to flag that education is so important. I'm just picking one place. Think of the Sahel in West Africa. I think the education gap in countries in West Africa, in the Sahel in particular, plagued by violence, by terrorism, almost civil war in some places, huge displacement, climate change, you name it. But the education gap is one of the root causes. I have absolutely no doubt about that. And the education gap widens with violence because terrorists, for example, or armed groups attack schools. So they make that education gap even bigger. But one of the results of their presence, of their thriving, is also the education gap that allows them to gain credibility among disenfranchised population. So thank you very much. I think as usual, I went over my time, but I think this is a topic that is, I'm very passionate about this. I'm not an education expert, and but I can see how important it is in the way we try to help those that are the weakest, the most vulnerable in this global multiple crisis, multifaceted crisis, and how education is important so that the people who are victims of conflict, of violence, of human rights violations actually are not vulnerable, because it is on their resilience that we must count above all to respond and be successful. Thank you very much.
Very, very important point for us. Come to the High Commissioner is open to questions. So if you raise your hand, I'll act as moderator. Please keep your questions precise, and we'll take it from there. There's a first question. And please introduce yourself.
Hi. I don't know if this is on. There we go. Hi, my name is Drew Edwards. I'm from Pangea Educational Development, an NGO in Uganda. One, thank you for your remarks. Thanks for your commitment to education. I guess I have a question, especially on the eve of a new sort of renewal in your contract here. Given all these priorities, if any of them are going to fail, what reasons do you think that they'll be? You have so much visibility into all of these ecosystems and stakeholders, and just curious which ones you're most concerned about.
Personally, I think there are many interconnected causes generating the potential, let's hope not, but the potential failure of the international system to respond to this interconnected crisis. But fundamentally, it's the lack of unity, it's the fragmentation of the system that is now the biggest danger. You know, the states will always have different agendas and even have strong rivalries and conflict. That's part of humanity. But I think that after the Second World War, the world understood, by creating the United Nations and its institutions, that there was a way forward where those tensions would be resolved through dialogue. You know, the world went through terrible times, not just now. The Cold War was very bloody, not in the rich world, but in the poor world where conflicts were fought by proxy. Still, there was always this underlying sense that in the end there was a place where one could go and talk. And I'm not now particularly advocating for the UN to be the only place, but for the spirit of dialogue to be preserved. Because this is obvious when you talk about conflict, which is one major threat of failure, but it is also necessary on climate. And that is undoubtedly one of the biggest challenges that we're facing now. And all of these responses to the various aspects of the crisis is one, it's a planetary crisis, but the different aspects require dialogue and negotiation. You know, climate is a negotiation on emissions, on compensations, on adaptation. I'm just giving you an example that is not in the education, but is a very important one. And the same applies in all aspects of our societies. I think that lack of dialogue, that disunity in the system of the nations is highly dangerous. And we have always lived with it, but always within certain safeguards. We may be going too far. And when it's too far, then it's deep. Even if there is no major, I'm not talking about a nuclear war, but even if we go too far when there is no return, then everything will be resolved only through conflict and confrontation, no cooperation, no compromise. Without that, the losers will be the weakest first, but then we will lose all. So we have to be careful.
Thank you for being here. I wanted to ask a question about one of your points, which related to embracing nationalism in terms of tertiary education and using our efforts to extend and expand that. Are there any particular initiatives or countries where you think that's been especially successful? And if so, could you share any of that with us, please? Thank you.
Well, you're talking about investing more in countries where many refugees are present and so forth. Yeah. Let me give you just 1 minute of background to that, why I say this. Now, one of my main job, mine meaning my organization's main job, is of course to ensure that refugees are protected and supported and that we find solutions. Now, the main theater of this action of protection, of assistance, of quest for solution are the countries that are the main recipient of refugees. And most of those countries are the countries neighboring conflict. There is always, like I said earlier, a misperception because refugees become more visible as they go towards the richer countries. But the majority of them stay where they are less visible, but where the hardship is greater and maybe the opportunity is less. So this is why I encourage networks like yours to see how you can be helpful to those countries, to those communities, and to the refugees and displaced living there. These are very complex issues. And I would look, if I were a network like yours, and to reply to your question without going into specifics of one country or the other, I would say, first of all, look at two things, or at two categories. Look at countries that have promulgated or have embraced very inclusive policies. I'm talking about education now. Take one, Jordan. So I am giving you an example because it's easier to understand. Jordan is a very good country from the point of view of access to education because, like many others, but it's been particularly visible. They had a lot of Syrian refugees and Iraqis before. They have an open policy. And so I think that helping those countries, because this functions positively in many ways, helping them. It helps strengthen their national system because they open up their national system, but they don't have resources to cover, like I said, so it helps, it strengthens their policies. It's a great recognition of that policy, which can serve of example to others, and of course, it helps lots of people. I'm simplifying a bit, a much more complex issue, but Jordan is a good example. Uganda is another example. Jordan has benefited from a lot of help. Places like Uganda, you are there, struggle now with resources. Uganda is one of the major refugee hosting countries in the world, has some of the most open policies in terms of inclusion, in education, in health, in access to livelihoods, and yet it's so difficult to mobilize resources to help Uganda, not just to help the refugees. So this is why I'm encouraging you, whatever you do, creating opportunities, scholarships, try to do it in places like that. Then it would be useful, but more difficult, to look at the opposite category, countries that have exclusive or have how can I say, less inclusive policies. Countries where we struggle to convince the governments to accept refugees in their schools. Now, this is more difficult. And this is where, of course, we have to lead as a refugee organization to fight for those policies to improve. But, in order to make headways and to have openings, to have networks that help us lobby, mobilize resources, so countries say, okay, we'll open up, but we know that the resources are coming. interact with their own civil societies of those countries. This is something that civil society can do better than us. There's multiple advantages, but it's more difficult. So my advice is, if you have to expand that, start where it's a bit easier and much needed, and then we keep talking.
Colin Gilbert, formerly with Jesuit Refugee Service in the Middle East. My question's around forced displacement that is going to be caused by climate change. And I know Rand Corporation had a recent report that showed that the majority of it is going to be internal displacement, sea level rise, food production, et cetera. I'm curious if UNHCR, and I know UNHCR doesn't always do the cluster approach to that, but is there, are there plans, are there strategies, are there concrete planning that's happening that is going to be in response to large numbers of people being forced to move because of climate change?
Yeah, you know, this is an extremely important question that very often is raised. I think that we just have to add, I don't mean to be too complicated or difficult, but I think we need to qualify a bit. What do we mean? Because we read it everywhere. Oh, climate will displace people. What does that mean? It means many things. You know, if sea levels rise in low coastal areas in some countries or small islands, that will displace people for sure. People cannot just go underwater. But it's very different from the type of displacement that extreme weather phenomena, also caused by climate change, can cause, which is sudden, rapid, and like an emergency. And then you have indirect, but not so indirect, effect of climate on displacement when you have conflict. You know, conflict and climate are a very interesting correlation, because you can have conflict in climate fragile situations, like the Horn of Africa, for example, where you add up, then you have drought and conflict together. This is a powerful displacer or driver of displacement. But you can even have conflict generated by climate. I often, my colleagues may have heard me say that before, I quote an experience I had in Cameroon just a few months ago, where I went to visit an area which was formerly occupied by Lake Chad, you know, one of the biggest water basins in Central West Africa. Lake Chad is drying, has almost completely dried up as a result of climate change. So that generates conflict between herders and people that live off agriculture, right? Because those that have to plant vegetables or trees have to dig deep trenches to reach the water that is going deeper and deeper, and then livestock falls into the trenches. It sounds like a little countryside story, but this has generated a conflict that has caused thousands of deaths between communities and displacement. So how do you classify all these people? People say, why don't you say climate refugees? I say, yeah, I can say that, but the reality is more complex. Climate will impact population movements in many different ways. So we have, in this context, developed a strategy, as you asked the question, a climate action strategy for my organization, like most others, that recognizes this complexity and indicates where we can be helpful. Frankly, I'm not so sure we can be terribly helpful in the slow rise of sea levels. This is for other organizations to look at. But if people flee, like in Cameroon, we have a lot to contribute to the response. And that's why I think what we need to do is take into account this additional factor of displacement more and more in building preventive measures. We have, for example, designed a rather sophisticated advisory system based, again, sounds very simple, on the prices of livestock in local markets. Observing how the prices of livestock go up and down, you can predict displacement due to this combination of conflict and climate. I'm simplifying, but this predictive analytics, as we call it, we're using it now in many parts of Africa, and other organizations are using it. So that's why what I'm saying is we need to take climate into more account, more serious account, why it happens, what effects it can have on population movements. And a final point, sorry, we're going away from education here, but maybe not so much. Displacement in itself can be, it's the reverse, can be a climate change factor. You know, if you go to Bangladesh, where 1 million Rohingya refugees have fled, as you know, from Myanmar a few years back, the area in which they live, which is a phenomenally large city in the forest, has caused enormous deforestation in a very fragile environment. You understand all the consequence. So we are also looking at how we can mitigate the impacts. That's quite the reverse. You know, first comes the displacement and then the impact on climate. And I don't think we've been very good at that over the years. But now there is more conscience, more resources, more interests. So I think it's one of the fundamental directions of our work in the next few years. And something we should be talking in schools about, by the way.
Please introduce yourself.
Hi, Commissioner. I'm Rod Berger with Forbes. You've been talking about unity being maybe the most dangerous amongst nations, the lack of unity. I'd like to talk about the narrative. We learned this week that about 86% of refugees reside in host countries that are of the lower income. And I'm wondering about how we change the narrative so that the wealthier nations see refugees as an asset and not a burden. And what can we do to change that storyline?
Yeah, I've been trying very hard. This is very fundamental what you're saying, for sure. What can we do? You know, communication is so important in this line of work. I don't like to call it business. In this line of work, it's so important how we talk about it. You know, I don't think there is any better way to show that refugees are an asset, a net contributor to societies hosting them, than letting refugees talk by themselves. We have some here. They're the best advocate for themselves and for all the others that do not have a voice. And that's why we've been trying, and it's not easy. You know, many people here have been in many discussions with me. It's not easy to find ways to have that voice heard, but we need to do everything we can. And I think as educational institutions or organizations, you can help a lot by helping refugees that are in your institutions, that you welcome in your institution or you help have access to education, learn also more about carrying that voice and talking about themselves as contributor. That is very, I mean, there's many other things that one can say. There are some opportunities, I think. I don't know if they're good opportunities. The context is very worrying, but there are opportunities in this worrying context. COVID started that. You know, how many in Europe, here in Europe, how many refugees and migrants contributed to the COVID response? You know, we did studies about it. We highlighted examples. That was phenomenal because everybody understood COVID was so close to every single individual in the world that everybody understood that if somebody was there to help, he or she was doing something useful for everybody. So that opened up a window. And now we were just talking about this earlier today. You know, in many rich countries, granted, rich countries, you have a crisis of employment, which is due to, you know, you need more people. I was in Canada just a few weeks ago, months ago. They had 1 million vacancies that they cannot fill with national, you know, intake or the already existing immigration. So they need more people. So, but we need to make sure that governments who are now increasingly talking about that, of the needs for more people to come and work and contribute to society, to admit that this needs to be done through two things. One is a better regulated migration, because this is fundamental, and except for very few countries, this is not happening. The compact on migration, this is not the one that my organization deals with, but the other one, offers very important tools to government for a regulated migration. Regulated migration is important because otherwise, since the need is there, people will go through irregular channels, and that will project a negative narrative and not a positive one. But a regulated migration means that states have to admit that they need more people from outside because they don't have enough nationals to do it, and this is politically difficult. It's their fault because they've built the negative narrative on migration, and now they're victims of that because they cannot justify more migration, right? And then, of course, there is the issue of refugees. Refugees are an asset, and I think we have to say that. They can also be, we always say refugees and migrants are separate, but in this case, refugees are also can also be migrants that contribute to a society. But we have to be careful, and I discussed this with my colleagues today, that in pushing this positive narrative, we do not say that the good refugees are those that can contribute and the others are not. Because refugees are not moving because of economic needs. They're moving because they are in danger or persecuted or out of war. And there may be some that are not so easy to integrate and not so much a net contributor from the beginning. They're very vulnerable. They need special care. Ultimately, we all contribute to society in different ways. But we have to be careful that it doesn't become too much of a, sorry if I use this word, of a capitalist logic, whereby the good refugees and the good migrants are those that can contribute, and the other ones that need social protection and care are excluded. But sorry, I'm going a bit away from your question, but you see what I mean. It's an important part of what we do. And if I may conclude, it's even more difficult in poor countries. You all know, maybe some of you even live there or are from there, the situation in Lebanon is very dramatic. This is a country, I mentioned Lebanon because Lebanon hosts hundreds of thousands of refugees, has hosted for decades, first the Palestinian, then the Iraqis, now massive number of Syrians. It's always been complicated in Lebanon for many reasons, religious, ethnic, social and economic, but now with Lebanon basically precipitating every day in a terrible crisis, financial and economic crisis, the presence of refugees has become politically very sensitive, and the narrative is becoming exactly the opposite. But you see, it's easier for us to push that narrative in a wealthier countries, in a more stable country. In a country like Lebanon, it's very difficult. How do you say they're contributing when unemployment is skyrocketing among nationals and so forth? So we need to think about all these things, and the reply there is first try to find a solution to refugees living in large numbers in poor countries, and then to help those countries with more resources so they can continue to host them in spite of their difficulties.
I think we'll take one more question, please, and identify yourself in the back.
Thank you very much. Is it working? Yeah. Hi, I'm Roberta Bassett. I'm the global lead for tertiary education at the World Bank. You mentioned in your speech the challenges of humanitarian policies and development policies working in concert. And this is a subject that's very dear to me and one that I've been working with your team at UNHCR to try to bridge. I'd be curious to just hear from you what you see as those barriers in the narrative around humanitarian policy and development policy on the ground, and maybe what you see as maybe some quick wins that we could move forward as we build this greater dialogue, this greater narrative on how to do that more effectively. Thank you.
First of all, I'm happy you're here. I am so proud of the partnership that we have built with the World Bank over the years. You've been really our partner of choice in bridging this divide between humanitarian and development. I always say when I go to conferences, to meetings where people say, we have to bridge that divide, I said, well, stop, we are already bridging it, we're doing it, it's possible, it's easy, but it requires literally political will on the part of the leaderships of organizations to come together. But I think that what the World Bank has done is phenomenal in terms of building that bridge in refugee situations. And for everybody's knowledge, but maybe you've spoken about it, the bank, the World Bank, basically, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm using non-specialist terms here because I'm really very ignorant in these matters, but the bank developed financial instruments that are designed to help countries hosting large numbers of refugees. The different financial instruments according to the level of development of countries. Poorer countries benefit from certain instruments, middle-income countries from other level, and that's remarkable too, because the bank understood that it was not just poorer countries, but countries like Lebanon, like Colombia, that needed to be helped. So a spectrum of financial instruments. So governments that host large numbers of refugees can apply to these funds, can say, I have an extra 200,000 children in our schools, to stay with the theme, and can I apply to this instrument? And then there is a discussion. UNHCR is just a facilitator, but it's really between the World Bank, and now other institutions are following suit, and the respective government. That's a big macro, if you wish, a bit technical, but I think it's really the way to go. To me, that's the future of humanitarian assistance. In this, we always lament that we don't have enough money. We can squeeze those humanitarian budgets in rich countries even more. Probably we can squeeze a little bit more. There's always a little bit more that can be given. That's my philosophy. However, I recognize humanitarian budgets are short-term. They don't create self-reliance. They don't create inclusion. So we need to really cooperate with specialized institutions, especially in the key areas: education, health, livelihoods, I would say, maybe in certain ways infrastructure, and now there is the big climate discussion that is coming up. So I think this is where we need to continue and give the example also for different contexts. It's not just refugees, it's drought, and I know it's moving, the discourse is moving. Where the obstacles are is that I can see it. Governments hosting large populations are suspicious on a number of fronts. One is that, of course, you represent a bank. A bank is a bank, is not a humanitarian organization. You do loans, although extremely concessional, etc., etc. You also do grants, but it's a mix. And governments get very nervous around that. How many times I have heard, why do I have to borrow money instead of receiving free money to serve a population that is not ours? I'm already doing a service to the world by hosting refugees. Why now I have to pay interest? That's why, the bank has explained many times, but, we do it so concessional that in fact, the burden is microscopic, but it's a complex, and there is some resistance around that. The other resistance is that they're used to organizations like ours to be the immediate responder and to mobilize resources. They know how it works. They know that we have to do it out of our mandate. They don't trust other organizations that do not have this in their mandate, right? It's UNHCR that has the mandate to deal with refugees, not the World Bank, not UNDP, not bilaterals. So we keep saying to those institutions, and that's my final point, in your discourse, the World Bank is about poverty, is about reducing poverty, eliminating poverty. And we have to admit that displacement, refugees, are a threat to prosperity for the people themselves who are displaced, but also for the communities hosting them. So helping them is also a poverty alleviation strategy. And I think it's important to frame this in the bigger picture, like it's important to frame the fight against displacement in the climate discourse, it's important to frame it in the poverty alleviation discourse. And there is where we need to work more on the narrative, to win those resistances, to create comfort, to make everybody understand that that's the way forward, that's the sustainable way, and education has a huge part in it. Because we want to give, not to create a classroom for people that last for 2 years. We want to make sure that kids go to school for the remainder of their school years until they graduate. And for that, our resources and our approach are not sufficient.
Thank you very much. Would you be willing to take one more question?
I am willing. If my
Christian Hülsaster from DID in Germany. We have been designing complementary pathway programs for a couple of years already, starting with Syria and with Afghanistan. And overall, I would say it worked rather well. People have been integrating into German society. With the Syrians, for example, we had a success rate of 96%. All of them found well-paid jobs. So you could say in the end, everything's perfect. But is it really? My question would be, do we do enough really to use the intellectual potential we have invested in also for perhaps rebuilding those countries we are talking about one day? Because I don't really have an answer to it. Well, people graduate and more or less they just, they disappear from our view. We don't know what's happening afterwards. And we don't provide any incentive, of course, to go back one day to Syria or to Afghanistan if the security situation would allow it. I understand it's not really your mandate because you take care of refugees, of course. But in the long run, I think this is a very important issue and we probably should invest a little bit more thinking here, what we can do in order perhaps to use the potential for the reconstruction of those conflict-affected countries.
First of all, it's great to hear the good results that you have achieved. That's a positive story. I hear what you're saying, and this is very much part of our mandate as well. But I would say this: first of all, complementary pathways. I really don't like. I know we use that word, but I think nobody understands except us what it means. But anyway, let's find a better word. But we know what it means anyway here. So I think it's good, they're useful, they're important. Continue that, please. Actually expand them. There's a huge need for that because they're great for the people that benefit from them, because they're usually well-structured and destined for success. They become a success story that is positive in the overall narrative. They are, these people will be the contributors. So they carry a phenomenally good story, which is global, far beyond their case. And then, of course, they're a very good story for the countries hosting large numbers of refugees, because even if it's small, you relieve a little bit their numbers, if not their burden. So for all these reasons, just like resettlement, complementary pathways are good. And they're still very small, so the potential is big. I would not stop that. But then you're right, and we were just discussing this over lunch today. Are these people going back? Mostly not. Do I understand? Yeah, of course, we have some here, you can't, why should they if they don't want to? We should be free to make choices in life. And I think clearly they will have more opportunities in other places. But this is why I go back to the point that I've made several times, that in addition, not instead, in addition to complementary pathways, let's invest more in opportunity for education in those countries where the large numbers of people, the 86% is. Let's invest there, because in any case, the majority of those people will not have the opportunity to go through complementary pathways. So they will stay where they are, but this should not be a reason for which they are deprived of opportunity. Maybe the opportunities will not be as great or exciting as going to study in a German university, but there are opportunities in countries like Kenya or Turkey or Jordan, or I've seen it in so many countries. Not every country allows this to happen, so we need to push them, but that investment is very important. And because, and I said it earlier, those people that are refugees in country X and go to a university in that country are more likely to then stay there and contribute, and maybe even go back to their country and contribute to the rebuilding of their country. One of the strongest arguments we always make to host countries that are reluctant to give an education to children. Bangladesh has been not easy in that respect. This is not a criticism. They have an immense burden. And, they have been resistant. Now we've obtained access to education, at least at certain levels. But they always say no, because these people have to go back. But we keep telling them, if you don't equip them with knowledge, they will go back and what? They'll be in crisis again, and then they risk coming back again here. So to make sustainable that return, if it happens, I don't know if it happens. And you know, this is actually the philosophy of the Ugandan government. I have always admired, you know, President Museveni and his government have always said, for us, it's very important. We have received many times refugees from South Sudan, but we insist that we want to give them an education because maybe finally one time they'll go back and stay there and they will be equipped with the skills and the knowledge to really run their country in a manner that doesn't go back again into conflict. So, you know, that's my answer. So, never mind if these people, you know, I still hope that people that study in places like Germany, one day they can become great leaders in their country and lead their countries with the knowledge they have acquired, but we can't presume that. So investment there is probably the best answer.
Thank you very much. Just say a few words of thanks. Thank you very, very much on two levels for giving us many important things to think about and to do our planning from. That will be very, very helpful for us. But also thank you from the bottom of our hearts for taking the time to be with us. Your affirmation and support of what we're doing.